Good morning, everybody. It is the first full week of our remote learning experience, and here we go. I was kind of thinking that now that I have an online channel and an online presence, that my fans, of course, you are all my fans, I'm assuming, that I would need some sort of cute, fan club name. And I've been workshopping a lot of different names and ideas. And the one that's on the top of the list right now is calling my listening audience my JBs, kind of like babies, my little babies. So I'm kind of settling on that one unless there's a strong reaction against it. So today, JBs, our topic is crime, and it is the last topic under social control and deviance, with crime, of course, being that formal sanction, which we talked about earlier in this unit, and that formal sanctions as a form of social control is a way to punish behavior. Formally. So we have a whole system, which we'll talk about later. It's the criminal justice system, right? That is the formal organization that can use formal sanctions to specifically try to control and punish, behavior that our society finds to be in severe violation of the norms of our society. And so that kind of falls under the umbrella of crime. So this is a huge topic. The criminal justice system in the United States is gigantic, and we'll talk about some of the actual numbers here. You're going to get a lot of kind of statistics thrown at you through here. I'm going to go back and forth, try to show some charts, try to read some of the statistics that are in this unit, and we'll try to explore this topic together. If I get clumsy and I have to pause the recording, please be forgiving. This is not a professional setup like Mr. Allen has. I think that's his name, Mr. Allen. If you have him as a teacher, that guy has a pretty sweet professional looking setup. So I am not him. I am just Mr. J, and that's all I can, or maybe can't be. Anyway. Our topic is crime, and our main idea is that there are several different types of crime, and that's kind of the first part that we'll kind of cover and go over, and that the U.S. criminal justice system investigates, prosecutes, and punishes crime. Again, that formal organization that can use formal sanctions. So here's how your unit defines crime. Crime is any act that is labeled as such by those in authority and is prohibited by law. So I think that's pretty straightforward. And so here we have some statistics about what crime looks like. That picture may be hard to see, but I will go through what some of these statistics say. These graphs show a breakdown of arrests by the offender's sex, race, and age. Note that men are much more likely than women to be arrested and also to commit crimes. In terms of race, more than 2/3 of all people arrested are white. However, African Americans make up approximately 13% of the population, account for nearly 30% of arrests. So you will hear this. I'm going to stop, and I really want to try to parse out that little piece of data. And that is pretty true today, that again, African Americans, 13% of the population, but 30% of the of arrests in this country. But your book and good statistics and good social science tells us that despite that disparity, there is no link between race and criminality. And that if you really don't get fooled by statistics and data that tries to make a claim otherwise, because that's frankly dangerous and not a good way to think about the statistics. A better way to think about a statistic like that is that which racial groups experience more desperation and poverty in this country, and then, of course, are driven to commit more acts of crime, which is probably a much better statistical and frankly empathetic way to think about who does and does not commit crime. So your book highlights that even so many factors lead to an individual to commit a crime, there is no causal link between race and crime. Okay, the percentages for age are particularly dramatic. About 44% of all arrests involve people under 25. Moreover, people younger than 35 account for just over 2/3 of all arrests. And so, if we had to make social scientifically pertinent observation, it really is that a large percentage of crime is committed by young males in society. That is not to say that young men are more likely to commit crime individually, but as a measurement of our population, that is true, right? Under 25 years old, and right, if you want to if you want to bring in a little brain science into it, right? We know now that like our brains don't fully develop until 25. And so there's a really interesting kind of, how would you say, re-examination of what makes a criminal, right? I mean, if we know that young men's brains don't fully develop till 25, and that is also the vast proportion of individuals who commit crimes overall, right? That tells us something about like the development of the brain, our biology, and what that means for criminal behavior. I listened to a podcast once. I listen to podcasts. I'm very intellectual. That said that like one of the things that we may find barbaric, 200, 300 years from now, is this idea that we used to, punish and lock up people for committing crimes, but that 200, 300 years from now, we'll know so much more about neuroscience that we'll think that it was a barbaric practice to put those people away for something that may be biological versus some sort of conflict of free will, and then our people who choose to commit crime. Well, if your biology, kind of directs you towards committing crime because of brain development before 25, maybe it's wrong overall to think of crime as punishing those people because they are bad. Maybe it's just biology. But those are some of the statistics. Whoa, I really cannot say that word. Statistics. Let's practice that over and over again. So I'm going to show you this chart in a second because I do have access to it. The FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, organizes crime into 29 separate classifications. And then they have two broad categories, and you've probably heard of them before, but those categories are felonies and misdemeanors. So a felony, generally, is punishable by more than a year in a state prison. And examples of felonies are those more serious types of crimes like murder, rape, burglary, sale of illegal drugs. And the misdemeanors are those less serious crimes and are typically punishable by up to a year. So that's a bit of a distinction that our criminal justice system makes between two types of crimes. And let me pull this chart up for you, which I believe I have here. Let's click this and open this. Uh-oh, I'm going to have to scroll. Oh, here it is. I already had it open. Look at that. This guy's a pro. So I don't want to read through this whole chart, but I will just say words to justify keeping it up as you kind of look through this. But we have the 29 different types of offenses. And in the top there, you have your more serious crimes: murder, robbery, burglary, aggravated assault, theft, arson. And then below that, you have, still serious, but the less serious types of crimes. And you can look at this chart and see those 29 broad classifications of crime as passed down by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So let's go back here. And then your book highlights some of them, and I will also highlight those here. So we have violent crimes, and these are crimes in which there is some sort of violence that is inflicted upon the victim by the criminal. And these include things like murder, rape, robbery, assault. And they overall make a small percentage of all crimes in America, which is why, partially why they are more serious, is because they are overall rare. But they are also more serious, of course, because that idea of having to commit violence against the person of the victim. So your book highlights a couple ideas here, right? Every 22 seconds in America, there's a violent crime. Every 37 seconds, there's an aggravated assault. Every minute, 12 seconds, there's a robbery. Every half hour and 54 seconds, there's a murder. Now, admittedly, when I read that, that sounded kind of terrifying. When you put it in those terms, remember there's 350 million Americans, so we're talking about gigantic numbers versus this kind of time breakdown. And then I also want to highlight this idea that, like, since the 1990s, there has been a measurable, steady fall of violent crime in the United States. And I have that chart here, and I believe I have it on my next note here. But you can see all these downward trends about over violent crime in the past, oh my goodness, I'm about to do the thing. I was going to say 20 years ago was the 1990s, but that was, of course, was 2010, and it is now 2020, which means for the past 3 decades, I am, of course, ever aging on. But yes, over the past 3 decades, violent crime has measurably decreased as a trend across the United States. That's not to downplay the seriousness, but when you're bombarded in maybe mass media with messages of violent crime, it is easy to kind of feel fear and paranoia about violent crime in the country in general. But that downward trend is true. So other kind of ideas here. Let me scroll here. Okay, open these charts up for you to get a better look at while I go through the statistics. Most victims of violence are African American. In the case of murder, young African American men are much more likely to be victims. African American men between the ages of 18 and 24 have a victimization rate that is 8 times that of African American women and white men, and more than 30 times that of white women of the same age. According to the Centers for Disease Control, homicide was the leading cause of death among African American males between the ages of 16 and 35 in 2013. The majority of murders are committed with guns. Guns are used in about 69% of all murders, with handguns being the weapon used about 47% of the time. The rate of handgun use in homicides is higher in the United States than in any other industrialized country in the world. So that's something for you to kind of ruminate and think on. And I think your book really goes through that racial disparity, but again, really trying to make good social science statistics with this idea that, yes, it is true that minority groups commit more crimes, but also remember that minority groups are also then disproportionately the victims of those crimes. So something to keep in mind. Property crimes are really just, what you would think. Crimes that include property. So there's burglary. And then there's, I highlight this term larceny, which is theft other than auto theft. So that falls under larceny. And you can actually, I enjoyed this. I think I'll look it up again. The first picture on Wikipedia. I mean, this guy, if you had to hammer in the point that this guy is a criminal, this stock photo really illustrates that. That amused me. If it doesn't amuse you, well, get an x-ray to find your funny bone. Zing. Anyway, so property crime. FBI estimates suggest that a property crime is committed every 3 seconds in the United States. And again, though, that rate has been going down over the past 3 decades. Sociologists generally tie variations in the crime rate to changes in the population. People under the age of 25 commit a large percentage of crimes. Thus, as the younger population decreases, you also see a decrease in that type of crime. Your book makes a note here about this idea that there seems to be a tie between expensive drug habits leading people to then commit serious property crimes, which is an interesting measurable idea. That to feed that addiction, you may see that tied to the rate of a property crime. Another topic is this idea of the victimless crime. And I put this in parentheses. Your book doesn't put it in parentheses. Ooh, I put victimless crimes. Well, it should say crimes. And I put that in parentheses with this idea that there's a classification or an idea about crime in which it is, quote unquote, victimless. And these crimes include things like prostitution, illegal gambling, illegal drug use, and vagrancy, or in parentheses, homelessness. Now, technically, no one is being harmed versus things like violent crimes or property crimes, but you should reflect on the idea of the kind of indirect harm that can be caused by these types of criminal acts. So, for example, drug abuse, individuals who abuse drugs, while though victimless, quote unquote, harms families, harms communities. And so, you could say that there's an indirect victimization there. Things like illegal gambling. Again, does that erode away the community? Does that harm people, quote unquote? These are technically victimless, but the idea is that people are still being harmed with this type of crime. The next one are white-collar crimes, which have really become more and more into vogue, I would say, since the 1980s and the proliferation of Wall Street and billionaires and big money. And a white-collar crime are offenses committed by people of high social status in the course of their professional lives, things like fraud, tax evasion, insider trading, and political corruptions. You will see this, white-collar crime among like politicians, big businessmen, and these types of crimes are less visible, let's say, and they're less attractive. And I don't know if attractive is the right word, but they're less visible than things like murder, stealing, theft, right? These are the things that we are very familiar with, those types of crimes. But white-collar crime, things like insider trading, tax fraud, that are committed by a small percentage of people with high social status, not as visible in our social consciousness, but estimates show that white-collar crimes cost the United States $300 to $600 billion a year. These are gigantic sums of money. And the Department of Justice recovers something like $6.4 billion, which is a huge disparity between the cost of the crime and what the government is able to get back from these white-collar crimes. As a erosion of the fabric of society, there's something to be said about white-collar crimes where rich, powerful people commit these crimes. It erodes away at the trust of common people, right? So we have this idea that it is important for the economy to be strong so that the rest of us can live lives of comfort. I suppose that is broadly true. But if people in those high and powerful positions who get to live lives of privilege and wealth, if they then exploit the system for their own benefit, amongst the millions of Americans, that erodes away at the social fabric and the social trust that we have in our society. There's also an additional problem of, rich and powerful people who are not likely, but are, the ones who may commit white-collar crime when they are in the same circles, and then rich, powerful people seem to get away with crimes because of the help of other rich, powerful people. That leads to a lot of distrust amongst common working people that the system is rigged against them, right? And so I just have, I don't know if you know who this gentleman is, but this is Bernie Madoff, about 15, 16 years ago. Huge guy, ran a gigantic fund on Wall Street, took billions and billions and billions of dollars of both rich people's money and also common working people's money, and essentially ran a gigantic pyramid scheme, which caused a tremendous amount of suffering and harm amongst millions of Americans. And so the thing about white-collar crime is, you have this potential for one person to really harm and destroy the lives of millions of people because of the way that they have access to wealth and power. And then another one is organized crime. An organized crime is you have crime syndicates. And crime syndicates are large-scale operations of professional criminals that control some vice or legitimate business through violence or the threat of violence. So things like gangs are criminal syndicates. The mafia is a criminal syndicate, right? This idea that there are groups of criminals who essentially create illegitimate businesses and then treat crime essentially as a career and a way to make money. I will recommend a book to you, which I found to be very interesting. It was called 5 Families, and it's a book about the history of the mafia in America. Fascinating look at just like the tremendous amount of power and influence that criminal syndicates can have, and the billions and billions of dollars that these criminal syndicates can make on people's vice. And so kind of some classic organized crime, let's say business enterprises, quote unquote, include the trade of drugs, the smuggling of drugs, illegal gambling. Loan sharking is a classic practice where you provide illegal loans at high interest rates. And then, of course, the idea here is that, these are sometimes legal businesses, right? There are legal businesses that sell drugs. There are legal casinos. There are legal places to get loans. However, the biggest thing that a criminal syndicate has to maintain their business is using violence against the people who are involved somehow with the criminal syndicate. Again, the mafia, criminal gangs are examples of these ideas. So, social scientists and the criminal justice system track crime statistics, and there are 2 major sources of crime stats in the United States of America. The FBI releases the Uniform Crime Reports, or the UCR, every year, and this is a gigantic piece of information that measures, the crime statistics of the United States. And when we talk about how do we know that crime has dropped over the past 30 years? Well, we can measure that because of the annual report that the criminal justice system, specifically the FBI, releases to the general public and to the government. Sociologist Donald Black, however, identified some limitations to the data in these reports. So, not all complaints from citizens make their way into statistics. Responding officers have to file formal reports. More serious crime equals more likely to be reported. So there's probably a lot of low-level crime that does not go reported because they don't have the actual official reports at a particular police department, or a particular police officer just doesn't file that report. Individuals are less likely to report crimes if it involves friends or family. So when friends or family commit crimes, a lot of that goes unreported because people, in their little social groups protect the people in those social groups. Police likely to file reports when victims are members of higher social class or show officers respect. And so there's, again, kind of the idea of the white-collar crime, that people with power and privilege, when they commit crimes, sometimes they get off at higher rates than, people in poverty or lower social classes. In addition, and this is this last piece I have here for you, in addition, victims are less likely to report certain crimes, such as sexual assault. The National Crime Victimization Survey, the NCVS, conducted by the Bureau of Justice Statistics since 1973, gathers data from crime victims about reported and unreported crimes. Twice a year, researchers interview a representative sample of approximately 50,000 households. The NCVS makes up for the underreporting of certain crimes and provides a more personal look at crime victimization in the United States. As a result, it can be a useful supplement to the UCR. I'm going to pause here for a second. One, because I had to jump on a meeting, and it's a good break so I can prepare for the second piece of this lesson.